Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
This week, our topic is Identity Governance and Administration, or often known as IGA. And it is actually two different parts. There is identity governance, and then there's identity administration. And identity administration is often known as IAM, whereas like identity access management. But then there's this whole part of governance, which is policies and processes that cover different things as part of your identity program, like segregation of duties or role management, logging, access reviews, reporting, compliance. Those sorts of things make up the governance portion of it, whereas the administration is the day-to-day account and credential administration or user and device provisioning or deprovisioning, entitles management. Those are like the things that people are assigning to user accounts or groups or stuff like that. So that's the identity administration. But the governance part, I think, is often more mature and overlooked or not done correctly in a lot of organizations. And it's a key part of your cybersecurity defense. There are several things that make up IGA. And we'll start with user account lifecycle management. Now, this has been around for a very, very long time. And I think companies are usually pretty good and mature with their onboarding and offboarding for the most part. Onboarding is usually done very, very well because you have to get a new employee, you have to provision a user account, get them a machine, get them all the right access. Usually, you just take someone who's in the same role, so to speak, and copy their permissions, right? The problem with that is maybe it's not exactly correct. And so that's where, as you get more and more mature, you want to have a template of these are the permissions for this job role, rather than these are the permissions for this user, and I'm just going to copy it over. Because sometimes it's over permissioned and it's not exactly the same thing. The other thing is offboarding, usually also pretty good, but I've seen instances where, say, contractors have temporary accounts, and then because they're contractors and not full employees, they don't go through the HR system, and their accounts may just be active and never get turned off. So if you don't have a very good process on that, the best thing to do, in my opinion, is just to set the accounts to expire after a certain point. You can do this in Active Directory. You can do this in Azure Active Directory. Set them to just expire, and then when they complain, essentially, right, then you turn it back on for a certain period of time. Or better yet, you can set an expiration date if you know when the contractor is going to leave. That's the best part, is if you know that they're only going to be hired for 6 months, then just set the account to expire after 6 months and then just renew it next time, right, when they come back. I've seen contractor companies reuse accounts. So let's say Adam is a contractor for 6 months, and then I come in to replace him as another contractor, just another person in the seat, and the company didn't have time to provision accounts, so I'm just going to use Adam's credentials. And I'm like, hey, I need credentials for this system. My previous person, Adam, he had them, just going to extend those credentials. So I've seen that, and so that, I think, is something to keep, on top of. And then I think the hardest thing for most companies, if you have good onboarding and offboarding practices, the hardest one is internal job changes. Because when you do that, usually there's some overlap of you doing your old job and then doing your new job, and you may need different permissions for both. In that case, it's good to have an access review set in the future to say, when do you think you're going to have a cutover from this old job to the new job? We're going to do an access review in, say, 3 weeks or 6 weeks or something like that. Set a note or a ticket or something to pop up, and then do an access review and say, hey, are you still using these systems? Are you still using these permissions? And if not, go ahead and deprovision them. So, you don't want to hinder production and the business in general, but you also don't want to keep permissions that you don't need anymore.
I know some of our listeners are probably thinking to themselves, well, gosh, Adam and Andy, this is a pretty boring topic tonight. Maybe I'll skip this week's episode. But as we so often say on this show, and many other folks in the security industry say as well, just do the basics. And sometimes the basics are hard, but they're so important. And especially in this space, if you're kind of a technologist and you like to figure out how to automate things and stitch things together and make them flow really seamlessly, for things like onboarding and offboarding, there's a lot of capability today where you can streamline that whole process. And you do not have to be some huge enterprise in order to take advantage of this. Microsoft, as an example, has tools built into Azure Active Directory that can automatically import new users from an human capital management system or HCM system like a Workday or a SuccessFactors, and automatically bring them in, automatically offboard them when they leave. And it ties all into your HR system. So as long as HR is buttoned up, IT is buttoned up. And that's cool stuff. And again, you don't have to be super advanced to stand that up. It's pretty straightforward. I've stood it up. No, I haven't. I take that back. I've set it up like downstream provisioning to like a Salesforce app, which can inherit that though. So you can get it really slick where, HR creates a new person in the HCM system that flows into Azure AD. Azure AD then flows it into your onboarded federated third-party SaaS apps. And that can all happen automatically. And that's really cool when that works, right? So I think there's some opportunity here. Even if you're saying, man, this sounds really boring and really dull, obviously super important. And especially with offboarding SaaS apps that aren't federated with your identity provider, really good incentive to get them federated, because then that all happens automatically as opposed to, oh, I have to go to Box and kill their account there, and I have to go to Salesforce and delete their account there, and then I have to go over to Slack and delete their account there. If it's all federated, you got nothing to do. It just happens. So that's really cool. So again, I know some of this may seem dry, but there's a lot of attack surface in here when things don't go right. So as security practitioners, we should be really thinking about these sorts of things. And maybe even it's a good chance to go review some of them as well and make sure they're working as intended in your world.
Yeah, very important. I will tell you, in my experience at one company, the process for this was automated, and it worked so well that as soon as my job code changed, I immediately noticed that my permissions changed the day of. And that company was Best Buy. So I went from a salaried employee where I was able to access certain things. I was also able to load email onto my phone because I'm salaried, and wherever I went, I could be able to check email. And I changed job codes and moved to an hourly position. And when that happened, immediately my access to email on my phone was cut off because they didn't want hourly people checking email, because technically that would be against labor laws and you'd have to pay them for that time. So I was only able to check email on company systems inside of a store. And I was able to talk to the architect who actually did this, and he did it all with Active Directory on-prem. So Best Buy at the time, and they may still be very much an on-prem Active Directory shop. He did this all with scripting, tied into an old Oracle HR system. And as soon as your job code changed in there, it would update your security groups within your Active Directory user identity. and strip the ones that you don't need or add in the other ones. And so this was all automated, and it worked really well, but it did take some time to design. Now, there are third-party tools you can buy that can do this. Adam mentioned tying in like Workday or other HR systems into Azure Active Directory, which is also possible. And that's a lot easier to do with a web GUI and everything. You don't have to do a ton of scripting or anything like that. So, but all possible to do. And either way, if you don't do that, you can still have a process and then, manually follow that process. You can do a ticketing system. Most people have some sort of ticketing system like a Jira or what's the very common one IT system that
ServiceNow.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So most people have some sort of system like that where a ticket comes in and then you just manually follow the process, right? So at least having that. Service accounts, that's also a big one. I've always said to my customers, you should have a service account that's specific to a specific system. So you don't want to have a service account that looks that is used on multiple different systems and for multiple different purposes, like a quote unquote general service account. That is a big, huge no-no. Have purpose-built service accounts that are for one system. Now, that can get a little cumbersome, especially if you don't have some sort of identity system to house secrets. But there are systems that you can use to do that, and I would recommend doing that. So having multiple different service accounts for all the things that you need. Privileged accounts as well, that's often overlooked because you'll turn off their user account with an HR system or with their email or whatever. That's the most common one. But then if they're an administrator, you may have administrative accounts that you need to go and turn off manually as well. So having a good process on those user account lifecycle management. Inactive accounts, I've also seen attack surface there as well. If you keep inactive accounts in some deactivated OU somewhere for compliance, I've known companies to never delete Active Directory users. I don't know what the compliance requirement is for that, but I would say if you don't need the accounts, to remove them. At the very minimum, if you're deactivating an account in Active Directory, I would strip all the security groups and permissions from it. If you want to keep the object there for whatever reason, to say, hey, this person used to work here, we had an audit of all the previous users that were here and we've never deleted them, that's fine. But at least remove them, because if anything ever gets compromised, an administrator can just reactivate the accounts, and then if they already have permissions, then they're gonna be able to compromise more things and laterally move. So if you need to keep them around, I would definitely recommend just stripping all the security groups and permissions from those users.
That one's an interesting one you just pointed out, where perhaps an organization is keeping inactive accounts in Active Directory for some reason. And like you said, it's probably some sort of compliance rationale. Do not do this as much as possible. And I'm not applying this advice to Active Directory specifically. I actually want to genericize this device across using some sort of like management or directory system as a system of record. That's not what they're for. On a related note, I once had a customer who said, we use, and I believe it was Mobile Iron, it was a non-Microsoft mobile device management solution. We use that as our mobile device inventory system. I'm like, what? Like, that's not what it is. It's a device management system. They didn't like the way Intune purged stuff. Like when you retire a device, Intune gets rid of it. It goes poof, it's gone. They're like, no, we want to keep that around so we know like what devices have ever been in. I'm like, no, that's not what this is for. So if you're doing that to keep some sort of record of like identities in your environment, please look into some sort of better way. I mean, at a minimum, have some sort of script like dump to an XML file, like your objects, and then store that in some secure location. But Active Directory itself is not a system of record. It's a directory of active users right now that need access to stuff. And so don't use it to try to do another thing. I see this not frequently, but often enough to kind of mention, make sure you're using tools for their intended purpose, because when you're not, that's another way of introducing accidental attack surface.
Well said. Good call out there, Adam. Password management is definitely part of IGA, having good policies there. Obviously, Adam and I are very huge proponents of going passwordless, but we understand that many organizations are still using passwords. And of course, if you're Active Directory company, you're going to have passwords. So having good password hygiene there, checking users that might have the never expire password checked off. Stuff like that. So doing a good audit and review of those. Single sign-on and OAuth applications. Adam talked about how getting those applications federated with your identity provider. That is a very good thing, because then you have one switch to turn off, right? So if you are federating all of your apps with, say, Azure Active Directory or maybe Okta or Ping or something else, and then that's tied into your Active Directory on premises, then you disable the account. That will then usually disable your cloud account as well as any applications that have been federated with that identity. And that's the best way to do it. So, and then OAuth is a whole nother thing as well. You want to lock this down and make sure, because by default, any user can OAuth to Azure Active Directory with their credentials and onboard different applications that may have different permissions that you probably don't want to be authorized in your environment. So sometimes they have the ability to read and write all user mailboxes. That's probably something you want to approve if it's a business critical application. But, taking a look at OAuth applications and what has been authorized before and limiting that. And then, of course, just in general, managing permissions of things. And we'll talk about how Microsoft does it, but there's other tools out there. But just being able to request new permissions to different resources, or remove permissions that are over permissions. So looking at just permissions in general for what users have access to. There's a new tool from Microsoft called Entra Permissions Management, and it's part of a category that's called Cloud Infrastructure Entitlements Management. And that takes a look at users and their permissioning within cloud applications, and to see how often they're using those permissions, how, and if they aren't using their permissions very often, they could be over permissioned. So you can remove permissions and pair them back to what they use on a daily basis. I've also done this in general, like looking at what they have access to and taking away all the permissions that I don't think they need. And then usually they'll come to me and say, hey, I tried to do this thing that I need to do and I can't do it now. And then so slowly adding more permissions until you feel like they are properly permissioned. So, that's one way to do it if you don't have a tool like Entra's permission management.
You can always do the old yank it away and wait for screams approach. And I've promoted that approach on more than one occasion on this show. I think sometimes there's too much of a hesitation. Sometimes to make an omelet, you got to break a couple eggs. And sometimes to get to the most secure state, you may accidentally go a little too far. And as long as you've got a solid process in place to pull it back and fix it, no harm, no foul, at least in my opinion. If I'm ever an IT leader again, that's something, I would be more comfortable with. We're not going to disrupt the business. We're going to fix it quick, but that's how we know kind of where the line is. don't step over that line, but we can toe the line. And it's interesting. So a couple of the items you just called out here, Andy, I was reminded of different scenarios we encountered in our day job. So both Andy and I work for Microsoft in our security field sales business. And you were just going through these and I was thinking, oh yeah, I remember that customer was having problems with that. So you talked about with single sign-on, all the benefits of having SaaS apps federated with your identity provider. And if you don't, we talked about like you have to go manually disable all those. And well, we had a customer where they had encountered some sort of data loss because a person had been offboarded, but an account somewhere on some SaaS application was left online and they were able to access it even after they had been offboarded, so to speak. And there were concerns with that. And so they wanted to button that up. And the way you do that, you first have to discover all the shadow IT in your environment. What are sanctioned apps that we encourage the use of in this company? What are the unsanctioned apps that we discourage? And this organization was really fortunate, and I don't want to get off on a big tangent here, but they were already deployed with Microsoft Defender for Endpoint on all their devices. And they also already were entitled to use Microsoft Defender for cloud apps. And in this scenario, they were able to immediately start getting that app discovery, that shadow IT visibility, leveraging the Defender for Endpoint agent on all their devices to see where are their users going, what are they accessing. And then they're able to kind of map that out, figure out what's sanctioned versus unsanctioned. And then for those sanctioned apps, then kind of stand up a project to be like, all right, which one of these are we going to onboard to Azure Active Directory and enforce single sign-on moving forward? And so now they're able to take something that was a bad situation, but up their security game as a result of it. And then the other one, you touched briefly on like Entra permissions management, and that came to Microsoft through the CloudKnox acquisition back in 2020. And it's that new class of product, CIEM. But we had a different customer where an account had become compromised in their Azure environment, and the attacker was able to spin up a whole bunch of VMs and use them, we assume, to mine crypto or something. And that account also had permission to like basically say, yes, it's okay that I'm exceeding the quota for this subscription and run up a big bill. Now, their theory was, hey, these are app developers. They need an elevated level of permissioning. Perhaps that's true, but developers probably do not need the permissions to change settings on the subscription and to like ignore quota on the subscription. That's probably over permissioning. And so you might not need necessarily Entra permissions management to discover that, although it could help. But those are scenarios where when you do have a user who has elevated privileges, make sure it's just enough access. Even then, what do developers need elevated privilege for? It's not everything. There's a couple of specific things they might need. We need to be able to spin up our own VMs. We need to be able to write to this storage blob, whatever. That's fine. But, those are scenarios, again, where by, again, not having kind of the identity basics buttoned up in these two organizations, they ran into challenges. And both times we started the conversation, and both times, Andy, we started off with, this is ultimately an identity problem. It all comes back to identity. I know it's like a broken record. I know we're all sick of identity's the control plane, identity's this, but it always comes back to identity. I mean, the joke is it's always DNS, but I think in a lot of compromised scenarios where you've had unauthorized access, it usually starts with identity or pretty darn close to it. I mean, maybe a phishing link or a malicious attachment to get somebody to give up their credentials. But from that point forward, it's all identity.
Yeah. And so you talked about Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps. That is in the category of CASB, which is Cloud Access Security Brokers. And there's a number of products out there that can kind of do the same thing. We use Defender for Endpoint, which is kind of built into Windows. And the benefit there is you don't have to install another agent. You can just use the same agent to discover apps. But like a company like Zscaler or Netscope or something like that, you can install their agent and they can do the same thing, right? So it's endpoint discovery, what the users are going to, and then seeing what apps, how much data is leaving and how much data is getting downloaded, and being able to limit that sort of traffic. And the beauty of that is, let's say I see on my user's computer that they're going to Box, and we're not a Box company. We don't use Box. Maybe we use Dropbox, or maybe we use OneDrive, but we definitely don't use Box. And now we see data that's being uploaded to Box. That visibility is important, right? And so being able to discover that and then saying, oh, maybe this shop is now using Box and it's a company sanctioned application. Let's get that onboarded with single sign-on. That way those users are getting provisioned within our identity management. And if those users leave, we can turn them off, and then they won't have access to company data anymore. So that's the benefit of the whole, why we kind of went on the CASB tangent, but it's tying back into IGA in a very real and tangible way.
Absolutely. And part of my example too was just illustrating how, in the case of that organization, and many of our listeners may be in a similar state, where they owned all the tools they needed to do that. They just weren't putting the pieces together. All of it was there. And even all of the plumbing was already stood up. We didn't even have to say like, well, you need to go deploy this to all your endpoints. They're like, yeah, it's already done. It's like, great. There's a ton of data coming off those endpoints that you're not leveraging, and you can leverage it to get those insights and take the actions you need to get to the state you want to get to. They weren't that far away from it. It was just about putting the pieces together. So, different orgs might have different puzzle pieces they're putting together, but the result is the same, that they can get to a similar state, get the insights they need, and ultimately harden their environment. I just found it more interesting than anything that they owned everything. They had everything stood up. They just didn't have the pieces put together. And so it was kind of nice where, you don't get that very often, where it's like, I'm not selling you anything. You don't have to go buy anything new. You don't even have to do a ton of work. You just got to go here, kind of take a couple notes, have some internal conversations, and, there you go. It's not too bad. It's not too big of a lift to get to a really better place. And so I'd be willing to bet some of our listeners are in a similar boat.
Yeah, they were a Microsoft E3 customer, and actually, I think they were maybe E5,
yeah.
But even if you're an E3 customer, you can do this because Cloud App Discovery is part of E3, and so is Defender for Endpoint, and so they will work together.
Right.
True. If you want to do the enforcement part of it with policy, then you do need the E5. So speaking of over-permission, we talked a lot about over-permissioning, and one of the things that you can do is using just-in-time elevation for privileges. So something like Azure Active Directory Privileged Identity Management, or PIM, where I can elevate to a certain role just in time. Maybe a good example of this would be Global Administrator. There's no one who really needs Global Admin in Azure Active Directory every single day, all the time. And so PIM allows you to elevate to Global Administrator for a certain period of time. You can even put approvals, like maybe Adam needs to check off before I can go, someone appear on the team, another Global Administrator will have to sign off before you can elevate. You don't have to do that. Maybe you can just say require MFA each time you do it. But either way, it's another step that just doesn't prevent you from, or it prevents you from being over permissioned and having that role all the time. The other thing that you can do is, maybe it's not a role, but maybe it's a resource that you need access to. One of the things that not a lot of people talk about is Microsoft Entra Identity Governance. And that is part of Azure Active Directory P2. And a lot of companies have these for their administrators because of PIM. But part of the P2 licensing includes this identity governance, which not a lot of people talk about, but it's one of the best things that I think that's included, because what it does is it allows you to create access packages. And these packages can be assigned to Azure Active Directory security groups or Microsoft 365 teams or groups or SharePoint sites. And it allows you to have or request access or assign access to certain users. So an example would be, let's say I have a SharePoint site that has sensitive data and I want to prevent people from having access to that. Instead of manually having to do all this work, like Adam may be the administrator, and so he gets a request for it, and then he's got to go in there and manually assign it. And if I leave, he has to go in there and manually revoke it. You can automate this and just have it either assign automatically to a specific role in a security group as soon as they have access to that, or you can self-service it. Maybe it's not something that you need access to right away. It's something that when I need it, I will request access to it, and I can have that access expire automatically. It's very similar to PIM, but for resources. You can still use it, though, for roles, because you can now assign Azure roles to security groups. So a good example of this is local administrator on Azure Active Directory joined machines. I often get asked, how do I do this? How do I have local admin on Azure Active Directory joined machines? Well, there is a role for it, and you can use PIM to elevate to that role. To do that, though, you have to be in the Azure portal. The best part about the identity governance is that you can do it within a portal called myaccess.microsoft.com. So, you have myapps.microsoft.com, but this is My Access. And so it's one of those drop downs as you're looking at your Office 365 portal that you can go to, and then all your access packages that you've created are there. And maybe one of them will say local admin on Azure Active Directory joined devices. And you can request access and elevate via a security group that's assigned to the role. And you can even have it expire after a certain time, let's say 8 hours. Like, I'm a help desk employee and I need access to it for my workday. I'll request access. But once my workday is done, I don't have that access package anymore. It could be for a sensitive SharePoint site. It could be for a sensitive Teams thing. And so, and of course you can have reviews along the way. Like Adam could approve me, or I could just automatically get it. And then the other great thing about it is you can also have access reviews pop up automatically, like a reminder. One good one that I often recommend is have an access review for all external users that have access to your Azure Active Directory. Or you could do, let me look at this SharePoint site that has sensitive data. I want to do an access review for all the users who have access to it every 2 months. Or an access review for all the people in Exchange Administrator group. And the beauty of it is that it prompts you, sends you an email, says, hey, it's time for an access review. Let's check it out. Make sure that all the people who are in this group should be in this group. And if not, you need to remove them. So that's another way to just automate things, remind you, make sure that you're doing the things that you need to do. So again, identity governance within Microsoft Entra, super powerful. Definitely dive into this if you haven't looked into it. It does require Azure Active Directory P2 or EMS E5 and Microsoft E5, so ME5. Adam's the expert on licensing. I just talk about the cool stuff. So I'll let him jump in here and add his thoughts.
You forgot Security E5. It's the other way to buy it. There's a lot of ways to buy it. I love entitlements management. And I agree. One of the underappreciated capabilities in Azure Active Directory. And I like that you walk through a bunch of different scenarios for it. Now, I remember, Andy, we built that one for local administrator together because we were almost spitballing like, okay, wait. So there's a role in Azure AD for being the local administrator on an Azure AD joined device. And we're like, well, wait, we can assign that to a security group. We can build an entitlements management package that puts you in that group. and we can time bound it. We can require, some sort of approval or maybe automatic approval, and we can do all these things and it might work. And so we tried it and it totally worked. It was awesome. And it was like, man, okay, if you can do that, you can do just about anything with this. It really demonstrates the power. What I really like about this is, this is easy to use. Unlike, and they're really powerful tools, but like SailPoint and Savient, they require really expert level knowledge to get them stood up initially. And they're incredibly powerful, but incredibly complex tools. Really good stuff. Great partners, both of them. But again, they are the top of the top when it comes to capability and feature. This is something almost any administrator can stand up, even if you're not an identity governance guru. The other thing I like about it is that so much of it is end user facing, or can be. You talked about a lot of this management is done through the end user facing My Access portal, which is designed to be accessed by end users, non-technical users. And you can do things like self-service. You can do things like, I have a non-technical person who needs to add people to an entitlements package. For example, let's say you have a call center and you have a call center manager and you have a lot of turnover because it's a call center. You have a fair amount of churn in your employees. So the onboarding the new call center people to all the access they need was just too much work to do through maybe your existing process. But with this, you can give that call center manager, who is a non-technical person, not administrator, the ability to choose who they want to onboard to that entitlements package. And they can say, okay, yeah, we just hired this new person, add them there. Okay, now they have access to our SharePoint, our Teams site. They're in the correct security group so that their calling software works, on and on automatically. Really, really, really cool stuff. So I love this too. Love access reviews for your privileged accounts. One thing I like about access reviews too is they give you coaching. So if you're doing an access review and you're like, I don't know if I should leave that person in or not, it will tell you like, the system thinks you should remove them because they haven't touched it in 9 months. You're like, oh, okay, good to know. Yep, you're out. So it will help you with that as well. So definitely something to check out. I'd say even if you have SailPoint or Savient or some other IGA solution implemented in your environment, there are probably use cases where this is lighter, faster, quicker to get done for whatever you need to do. And there are some things that this is just going to be best at. Andy mentioned like external identities in your directory, what we used to think of as B2B users. It's going to be the easiest way to do an access review on them and remove the user stubs for users who haven't been in your environment in a long time. And they just don't need to be there anymore. So tons of cool stuff here, kind of limited only really by your imagination on what you can do with it. So definitely recommend, if you're a P2 customer, you check it out. And if you're not, you can always get a free trial to kick the tires on it and see if it's right for you. But it's just something I think we're really just educating our listeners on here, because again, you don't have to be an IGA guru to get this stood up. It's really, really quick. And so even for folks who are like, I don't normally get into that identity stuff, but that sounds interesting, you could get in there and you could do something right away. So you may have already a use case in mind. I'd encourage you to try it out and see if you can bring it to life.
Yeah. And you mentioned using it with like SailPoint or Savient. I'm pretty sure we use SailPoint or have an old SailPoint.
Old SailPoint.
Implementation. And one example of what you're talking about, Adam, is as a security technical specialist, I have access to a special M365 demo environment that gets saturated with a lot of threats. And so there are people who are feeding this system with all sorts of malicious things all the time. And I have to request access to that demo environment. In order to do that, I have to go to our SailPoint or on-premise IGA system, where I have to request access to a security group. Once I get access to that security group, then in the myaccess.microsoft.com, that opens up an access package. That package I have to request access to. It automatically gets approved, but it expires after a certain period of time. That way, if I do change jobs or I need it again, I just need to click the request access again, and it just gets approved, I think for like 6 months or a year or something like that. So, but my membership to that security group on premise, as far as I know, just stays. And having access to that security group just gives me access to the access package within the identity governance area. So you can tie it in multiple different ways. Like Adam said, if you already have an IGA system, still able to use the identity governance within Azure Active Directory. So hopefully you learned a little bit something about IGA. This is definitely a lot of basic things. As I'm talking, I'm hoping that you're nodding your head and thinking, yeah, I have that pretty much buttoned up. And if not, put this on your list. Identity is definitely one of those things you want to lock down and have this buttoned up. So that's our show for this week. Thanks for listening and watching as always. Our contact information will be in the show notes if you have any questions or topics that you want us to talk about in the future. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.